right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Fearcast. This is the podcast dedicated to OCD and anxiety spectrum disorders and getting your life back. I'm your host, Kevin Foss, and I'm a licensed therapist specializing in OCD and anxiety disorders. Thank you all so much for joining me for this episode. This was a super fun episode. It's going to be a little bit of a departure from our typical episodes, but if you're a previous listener to this podcast, you know that I throw in an interview here and there that I think is important or informational, or I just think is on a subject that's kind of cool within the world of OCD and anxiety. And this interview certainly qualifies as all of those things. So for those of you who are new, the typical podcast is a question and answer based show where you can send in your questions about OCD and anxiety, and I will listen to them, consider them, and likely put them up on a future episode. You can go over to fearcastpodcast.com and send in your question that way by clicking on the Submit a Question link. You can also send in an audio question. You click on the speech pipe button at the top of the website, fearcastpodcast.com, and do an audio recording of your question. Or you can go over to Instagram. I'm Fearcast Podcast over at Instagram, and you can send me a question by sending me a DM and recording your question by clicking on the little microphone button in the text box there. I have two questions that came in recently, one through Instagram, one through the speech pipe button. Either way, those go to the top of the list. Regular text questions, they kind of go back into the hopper of other questions, but there goes a little bit of a priority. Now, listen, if you're worried about anonymity, if you're worried about people finding out, you can change your voice. You can sound really goofy. You can have your friend read it. And give me whatever name you would like me to read. You know I'm going to pick that name. I think I had someone, Cheesecake Destroyer recently. So if it's not wildly offensive, send it in. I'm curious. I want to hear it. So for today's episode, I had Claire Breedlove join me again to talk about her work. So she was first on the podcast. I had to pull this up back in 2004 on episode 189, and she talked about her work with scrupulosity within the LDS Church. And she joined me again today to talk about a more specific version of that. So she shared her work with the LDS community on religious scrupulosity, but using the ICBT, so the inference-based cognitive behavioral therapy model. Now, I've had a bunch of podcasts where we've talked about that. I've interviewed some folks who are ICBT advocates, and so if you're interested in using ICBT or interested in how that works, you can go back and just Google Fearcast ICBT or whatever it is, IBT. I forget what I called it or what it has been called. It has changed over the years, but you can check those podcasts out. But Claire jumped on today to talk about her work with the LDS community. She talked a little bit about just what ICBT looks like, what how it's different from traditional ERP treatment, CBT treatment, and why she made that change and why she's starting to use ICBT more and more in her work. How she sometimes will incorporate still some typical ERP work into the ICBT stuff. How she finds kind of an adapted way to use ICBT in her work with somebody, and just kind of share some different ideas about how to make it work for you. Now, I'll say this, while we're talking real specific about the LDS community, the tools that she's talking about can absolutely be broadened out to anybody from any faith background and even any obsessive background. So it's not just, we're talking about specific to religious scrupulosity today. But again, all of these tools that we're talking about aren't germane just to one subtype or just to one religious tradition if there's a religious component to it. So it's a combination of all of that stuff that I want you to start thinking about how you can use those tools in your life and how to start using that to challenge yourself. So I'll be done with my yammering. So without further ado, here is I have a bio. I need to read that. Oh my goodness. All right, let me read this and then I'll get into it. Claire Breedlove is a licensed clinical social worker who specializes in working with members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to provide culturally competent, evidence-based treatment for religious and moral OCD, also known as scrupulosity. Claire is an active member of the International OCD Foundation and has completed the IOCDF's Pediatric Behavioral Therapy Training Institute, otherwise known as the BTTI. She's also a certified space provider, so supportive parenting for anxious childhood emotions, and is licensed to practice in California, Utah, Idaho, Arizona, and Texas. Claire holds a master's degree from Johns Hopkins University and the Tulane University School of Social Work, and currently serves as the board of directors of the Mormon Mental Health Association. She's also an adjunct professor at the University of Utah College of Social Work, where she teaches in the MSW program. For more information about her, check her out at mountainhomeocd.com. And now, without further ado, here is my conversation with Claire Breedlove. All right, Claire Breedlove, thank you so much for joining us for the Fearcast today to talk about ICBT specific to scrupulosity, and also maybe a little bit of throwing in there of ICBT with scrupulosity with the LDS community, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, getting excited.
Always.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for those of you who are new, I had Claire on a long time ago to talk about scrupulosity work specific to the LDS. I want to say LCSW, LDS community. So I'm so happy to have her back on to talk about her work with scrupulosity, but using the ICBT, the inference-based cognitive behavioral therapy approach. So I will stop my yammering and just say hi. Hi, how are you?
Hey, Kevin. It's great to be back on your podcast. I'm really excited to be here to talk about ICBT. I think I've been on a bit of a journey in my own practice since the last time I was here, and have really transitioned over the past few years from what I would think of as like a pretty traditional ERP and ACT focused OCD practice. Most of my clients are Latter-day Saints in Utah and other parts of the Intermountain West. To over the past few years, I've started using more and more ICBT to the point where today that is like the vast majority of my practice. So ICBT, just briefly for folks who might not be familiar, is an evidence-based treatment for OCD that does not involve exposures. And so in, traditional ERP, we're not especially concerned with like why someone is anxious about whatever they're anxious about, right? We're really just focused on getting the exposures in and habituating them to whatever the trigger is so that they don't feel anxious anymore. And that is, of course, like an extremely effective way to treat lots of OCD symptoms. But what I was running into in my largely Utah-based practice is that a lot of Latter-day Saints were really freaked out about doing exposures. Mm-hmm. And part of that was because there has been some, what I would consider bad or even unethical ERP done in Utah, where people were doing really kind of crass exposures, like, tear up a Book of Mormon or something like that, which I don't think is effective, but also people felt like it was really disrespectful to their like fundamental religious beliefs.
I would agree. It is.
Yeah. And so anyway, as I began kind of doing more ICBT training and everything, I was really interested as to like how I could apply this in my practice, because in ICBT, we're interested in like, okay, why are certain things triggering to you and not others? Like, why are you having OCD symptoms about these specific things, but not everything? Like, what are the fears? What are the stories that you have in your head that make certain things triggering? And then we work on that for a while. And then when people start to see like, oh, wait, there's a pattern to this, like, and they can start to confidently recognize like, yeah, that's my OCD. Then we work on changing how they're responding to the trigger so that they don't end up doing whatever the compulsion is, right? So, there are lots of ways that we look at that, like helping people understand how they're using different ways of thinking just for their OCD than they are for everything else in their life. So the way that I kind of think of it is ERP is like a little bit of a blunt hammer. Like we're just gonna like do the exposures and tell
do the thing.
Yeah, right.
Repeat it. What is it? Repeat and prolong and repeat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But ICBT is a much more like cognitive restructuring type approach. And so I think for a lot of Latter-day Saints who are, very disturbed because the symptoms they're having are really at like the core of like what we believe we're supposed to be doing in like this life and the next, that they would really rather not do the exposures if there was a different way.
Yeah. And I think that's where my understanding, my use of ICBT, that's kind of why it's there as a good alternative for folks who don't tend to respond to who aren't responding to traditional ERP, because we talked about exposure and response prevention, CBT. I suppose ACT is probably thrown in there as well as part of the quote gold standard of treatment, but that isn't effective for everybody, or not everybody resonates with that. But a lot of those folks will then resonate with this ICBT approach, and there are pros and cons, I think, in criticisms, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. For those, some of them are valid, some of them are maybe griping, but yeah, having an alternative for someone to be able to have that kind of inroads, if the one door to recovery is ERP, and someone just says, I'm not going through that door no matter what, whether legitimate reasons or not, or whatever it may be, then we need to find something else that's going to be able to help them and get some buy-in.
Yeah. And I do think that, many of the people I work with, like they do, it does feel relevant to them to ask, why am I worried about this? Like, why am I worried I'm not worthy?
Yeah.
And, so when in ERP, when we say, oh, that's irrelevant, like that, of course, there's a logic to why we say that in ERP, but that doesn't sit well with a lot of very religious Latter-day Saints.
Yeah. And, oh man, I had a great question. It's gone. I'll just stick with the second one. What would be, tell me about just even that question, right? You kind of talked about the question of like, why do I have this obsession? I think that's a question that we get a lot. And it's a reasonable question that people have. Why is it that I have this obsession and the person down the street doesn't even have that, or doesn't have that same, or the person within my same church, temple, ward, whatever it may be for you, why don't they have that too? How is that addressed through traditional CBT ERP? And how is that different for someone in the ICBT world?
Well, I like to kind of start out and tell people, like, look, we know there's a huge genetic component to this, right? And we know that for most people with OCD, they're going to start to have symptoms in their late teens or early 20s. And we also know that, like, you don't have obsessive thoughts about things that you don't care about, because then it wouldn't be an obsessive thought, right? Like, you wouldn't, So in my community, what that looks like is, what are a lot of LDS kids in their late teens or early 20s doing? They're going on missions. And they're devoting a year and a half or 2 years of their lives to exclusively church service. So when you take these kids who, most of the people I work with are like, yeah, maybe there wasn't a diagnosis, but my dad's really anxious, or something like that, right? Yeah. And you take them out of Idaho or wherever they're from, and you send them to Japan for 2 years, where all they're doing is religious work. Like, of course, if you have the predisposition for OCD, like,
it's going to find you.
Perfect storm. So, I try to really emphasize, like, this is just like any other chronic illness. Like, it's no different than if you had like diabetes or something, right? We just gotta, do the stuff and treat it. And, I also try to really emphasize to people that OCD is, it's ego dystonic, right? So part of the reason that the intrusive thoughts are so upsetting to you is that it's contrary to your core beliefs and values. So you wouldn't be having scrupulosity symptoms if it actually wasn't really important to you to be a good person. And so I think it is actually really helpful for some people to hear that, and just that they can see me reacting to them and to see that I don't think they're a bad person.
Mm-hmm.
In my extensive clinical experience, the people who tend to be worried about these kinds of things are really good people. And that's why this is so upsetting for them. So I think, part of it is just doing that kind of foundational psychoeducation that I would be doing if we were doing ERP or ICBT.
Yeah. And is some of that work that you're talking about there within the vulnerable self theme module?
Yeah. Yeah. And I was fortunate to do a lot of ICBT training with Kate Goldhouse.
Mm-hmm.
And she kind of organizes things a bit differently. But I would definitely, plug for Kate's training if anybody is interested in checking it out. But I've adapted a lot from that for use in my specific population.
Yeah. So when you're talking about ICBT and so someone comes into your office and shares that they have religious scrupulosity, and do you have it in your mind that you typically will just start with ICBT, or okay, so that's a yes. All right. For those of you who are just listening to this, there was a solid nod going on. Okay.
Yeah.
So
yes.
All right. So you kind of have that approach that you are going to start. How does this? Give me kind of the arc of what ICBT would look like for someone as you're working with them with religious scrupulosity.
Yeah. So I've kind of adapted Kate's adaptation. And so what I usually tell people is give me 8 weeks and then let's see where you're doing. So, the first session just for intake, mm-hmm. and then the next 7 weeks doing pretty targeted, focused ICBT work. So we start out with just foundational work about, what is an inference? What is inferential confusion? So explaining for anybody listening who's not familiar with
please
ICBT,
explain those terms because I hate those terms so much. I bought the book for it and I just crossed out inferential confusion and wrote what I think it means. So I'd love to hear. Yeah.
So the way I always explain it to people, I'm curious what you say, is that it's when you believe that X is true when Y is actually true instead, right? So to an example of what that would be in my context is you have to have not just anybody can rock up and go into an LDS temple. You have to have what's called a temple recommend that says you're worthy to enter the temple. So it would be even though you have a current temple recommend, you still think you're not worthy to go in, mm-hmm. right? So,
and these are big dealings for anybody who's not aware. That's a big deal.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it would if you're observant, that would be a big problem if you felt like you weren't worthy to be in the temple. So we talk a lot about that kind of dynamic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of, and then we also talk a lot about how OCD is just never it's never connected to reality, right? So when your OCD is telling you something, mm-hmm. It's not tipping you off, right? It's not going to help you with anything, get where you want to be with anything in life. It's always wrong. Right? Because I think that fear that oh, well, what if maybe it's not the OCD or maybe it's actually helping me, people are really worried, right? That if they don't, do whatever the compulsion it is, that something really bad is going to happen. Right. So firmly establishing no, the OCD is never connected to reality. We talk a lot about that. We talk about the obsessional sequence, right? So mm-hmm. this idea of what happens between the trigger and eventually leading to the compulsion, and how understanding that process and being able to break it down can be helpful for, mm-hmm. for lots of reasons. We talk about, the feared self and how you only have obsessional thoughts that are related to your feared self. I think that resonates with a lot of people because they start to understand that there's a pattern to what's going on for them, mm-hmm. right? We talk a lot about different kind of logical fallacies or messed up ways of thinking that people often use for things that are related to their OCD. So again, like other ways of helping people understand that like you're just like tripping yourself up in the same way over and over again about these things, and it's not real. We talk a lot about, kind of the idea of probability versus possibility, that just saying something is possible is not helpful, because literally anything is possible. Like you could burst into flames in front of me, but unless there's like actually something in reality that is suggesting that, like, if that lamp burst into flames, then I might be like, hey, Kevin, like back up, right? But absent something that information from the senses, right? To use the ICBT lingo, it's probably not something that you really need to spend a lot of time worrying about. And it's not something that you spend time worrying about in any context not related to your OCD. And then the other big thing that comes to mind, right, is we talk a lot about this concept of alternative stories.
Ooh,
so
yeah.
when you have OCD, it feels like there's an inevitability to it, right? It feels like that's the only explanation for what's going on. And so one of the things I try to do with people, especially early in treatment, is to see like, no, like there are other ways of explaining this, right? And to just kind of work on that like psychological flexibility a little bit.
Yeah. I appreciate that. And that's a water hose of information for a lot of
sorry,
folks.
that was like just everything that came to my mind.
But I was following you, but it's part of like there's a lot of things that you're talking about that let's see if I can summarize. It sounds like a lot of what you're doing is trying to look at that feared story that's going on in somebody's head, and trying to build this kind of argument about, where do these thoughts come from? What are they rooted in? How is your brain, how is your anxiety getting this information and packaging it in such a way that is convincing you that maybe it's more likely than not to be happening? And so therefore, how does that story justify all those compulsions that you're spending all of your time doing? So if you can break down and see where that story is coming from and how it's flawed, how it's missing vital pieces of information, then you can see that perhaps, just maybe, all those compulsions that you fought or that you've been doing for all those years perhaps is unnecessary, is useless, and in some ways, not even in some ways, and making you worse.
Yeah. And, I think that I tell people, like, I want you to be the expert in your own OCD.
Yeah.
And like understand what is going on in your brain when you're feeling anxious. And, one of the things about ICBT that I think really resonates with Latter-day Saints is that in ICBT, there really is this emphasis on choosing not to do the compulsion, like recognizing that like there's a choice, right? And I think for Latter-day Saints, like we have a lot of beliefs about agency in this life that really like it like resonates well for people. And just that the importance of feeling like you can study and understand what's going on and then make the choice that's best for you. And ICBT also talks a lot about like helping people like feel confident again. And that OCD is like this kind of constant barrage of doubt that makes you feel like you can't make good decisions. And so one thing I really try to work on with people is to say like let's look at the evidence, like let's look at what's going on in your life. Like you really like have every reason to feel confident. And like this OCD, which is making you doubt yourself so much, is like we can see it's not real. It doesn't mean it's not intense, it's not scary, it's not something to be taken seriously, but it's not real.
Yeah. It's when I use the primary thing that I use for my CBT in my work is that second module, And that second module looks at kind of how it's OCD's story. It's how is that narrative being created, and where are all the bits of information coming from that are packaged into it. And it's always this, I talk about it as this like rounding up. It's like yes, but definitely no, or it's yes, but certainly not enough. It may be a 49% accuracy, but it's missing vital pieces, which are what some of the other subsequent modules are about, kind of fleshing that out. But is that seeing that this is it really is a kind of wolf in sheep's clothing, or just it's a cheap overseas knockoff of the item that you're looking for. It's instead of Oreos, they're Floreos or something to that effect. But they look similar, but they're not the same.
Well, the way I often explain it to people is like, okay, if you are having some kind of like relationship OCD symptoms, which a lot of my clients have, right? And you are worried that somebody is actually mad at you, but they haven't said anything, right? Like the chances of that being an OCD symptom and that it being like totally not connected to reality and wrong, that is 100%, right? Like if it's the OCD, it's not going to be correct. So I'm always like, just take them at their word, right? Like if somebody doesn't tell you they're mad at you, like just believe what they're saying. And you can come back and be like, well, Claire, maybe they are mad at me, but they're not telling me. And it's like, well, yeah, that could happen, but the chance of that happening, it's always going to be smaller than the chance of the OCD being wrong, which is all the time.
Yeah. Man, I love the order of how that often goes. It's this, suddenly for no stinking reason. And maybe it's, they made this face when I was with them. Well, what the heck does that mean? And the brain goes, it's because they don't like you. Oh, my goodness. Yeah. So we go to this conclusion, well, they just must not like me. Yeah. And then they go into rumination land about why and how and what's going to happen and how do I fix it and what did I do and what's wrong with me and I'm the worst and all this stuff. Yeah. But then it could be corrected by and kind of those one and done quote reassurances, but it's the thing that we would do. Hey, are you upset? And the answer is no.
No. And in ICBT, we often will have clients ask, like, if you didn't have OCD, would you be worried about this? Right. And, sometimes people are really annoyed by that question. But, one thing that I think is actually helpful in my practice is that, I work with people, we're part of a small religious group that is highly centralized, of which I am a practicing member, right? And so when somebody who's LDS tells me something that's wacky, and I'm like, no, nobody's doing that. Like no one ever argues with me, right? Because it's very easy to tell when somebody's doing something that's like really non-standard in our community, which is helpful for OCD treatment.
Yeah. And I think it's certainly, that can kind of be a double-edged sword in a sense that, it's nice that someone that your clients have someone in on the other side of the couch, as it were, that is also a knowledgeable person within that community, within that religious tradition. So they can have a decent barometer of what is, quote, normal and typical and expected versus what is, off a little bit. But that can also very quickly lead into, to that point, let me add one more. That is a good reason to then meet with somebody. If you out there, listeners, are looking for a therapist for your religious scrupulosity, to find someone within your same religious tradition. But that being said, it can easily turn into that compulsion of, well, I'm just going to go ahead and check with Claire and see what she has to say. Because if she says it's fine, then I'm fine.
Yeah, no, and that's definitely something to that I always, as the therapist, am trying to like make sure that it doesn't turn into some reassurance seeking exercise in session. But I think actually that one of the reasons my practice has ended, like I did not like set out to have a like 99% like LDS group therapy practice. But I'm very grateful that is what it is. But the reason it is what it is because people are very nervous, understandably. I think especially with, you see all this like crazy stuff going on in popular culture, they're really nervous to talk to a non-LDS therapist.
I'll bet.
And I used to tell people, like, look, you can go to any well-trained OCD therapist and they're going to be able to help you, and don't worry about it. But over time, I have come to appreciate that I do think it is actually a lot of emotional work to try to explain some of the things that are like very specific to our religious culture and beliefs to somebody who is not of our faith, particularly like right now.
For sure, for sure. One of the hangups that we kind of briefly talked about, and one of the things that I've found is a struggle with ICBT training and kind of that discussion. You referenced grounding in your senses, right? There's a big push, and rightfully so, of what does the evidence tell you of the things around you? What did that person say? Did you see any dirt or spit or poop or grossness, and did you touch that? Was there any blood on that, right? Did you see it with your eyes? And we could go on and on with different examples. But one of the things that is a snag with religious scrupulosity is so much of faith is an intangible, right? It does have to do with things that we can't see, that we can't touch and feel.
Right.
So how do you work around that, or how do you work with that as a feature of faith?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I do talk about what Latter-day Saints would call like spiritual experiences, as I do consider that to be like information from the senses, right?
What is a spiritual experience? In terms of that specific term for an LDS individual.
So we are we have an idea that, right, if we have a question in our lives, spiritual or otherwise, that we can do certain things to gain knowledge and insight from God about those questions, right? And it's very like, they're specific things, right? Like prayer, scripture study, go to the temple, like kind of things that anybody who is a member of the church would know to do, right? And so the idea is that if you are kind of doing what you, like, the question of intent is important, right? Like if you're doing things with the intention of knowing something, whatever, right? That and you believe that you have what we would say, like, you've received revelation about that, that you should trust that, right?
Fair.
And I will often kind of compare and contrast for people, like, what it feels like for you when you're being like taught by the Spirit, or what other Christians would call like the Holy Ghost, versus like when you're anxious. So, we, believe that like the Spirit speaks to us with like a still small voice, that it's calm, that it's patient, right? And anxiety, by contrast, is like really loud. It's like in your face. It's urgent. It's demanding, right? So, if you believe that, like, you've been wondering, should I marry this person, right? And you have, prayed about it, you've gone to the temple, you've counseled with people you trust about it, and, you feel like, okay, this is it, right? You should trust that, right?
Go with it.
Yeah. And so it's not like clear cut in the sense of, I touched that toilet bowl and didn't die. But I do believe that spiritual things are also knowable, just in a, slightly different way.
Yeah. I think that's I think it's a great way to kind of bring that in as a way of, when I'm working with someone, and I tend to work with Protestant Christians if I'm working with a someone with religious scrupulosity. And
Yeah.
what I will probably say at the in the intro to this is we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about LDS related stuff, but everything that we're talking about here can be applied to someone else's faith and faith tradition. Yeah. So it's not just ICBT is meant for the LDS population.
No. And the other thing is, I think that people are often anxious that they want to see like some like grand sign. They want some like dramatic confirmation that what they are concerned about is, and so I actually go back. I mean, there are a lot of examples in the scriptures of times when people like did see had the visitation of angels and then they like didn't do what they were supposed to do. And, right. So to kind of work on this, that like, you should have confidence in this, in yourself, but also like the Lord, there's a lot of evidence that the Lord has confidence in you. Mm-hmm. And so you can make decisions even if you don't feel this like overwhelming, whatever physical sensation you feel like you need to be feeling to make a decision. Yeah.
What I love about the explanation that you just gave, though, just a moment ago, was using a typical part of your tradition and a typical understanding that someone would have about how one communicates with, receives messages from, and understands their relationship with God. So it's not something that is completely left field. This is something, as you're talking about, that is consistent within your tradition. So you can point back to this process and say, this is something that we talk about that is that we have a large body of information and kind of a bell curve on how people experience this thing, right? Yeah. So we can point back to that and say, all right, how did that go? Did that go as typical, as expected, or is it something completely out of the ordinary from what you or anybody else is talking about?
Yeah. And, I like to kind of compare, I really like how in like Judaism and Islam, they talk about, like in Islam, they talk about converts as being reverts, that like you were already Muslim and you're just like going back to that. And like in Judaism, they have like a kind of similar explanation. I think sometimes that you're already a Jewish soul. And so I tell people sometimes, like, I think like I just have a Latter-day Saint soul. And so God knows how to speak to me in certain ways because that's just like how I see things and how I understand things and how I learn about spiritual things. And people, I think that tends to resonate too with people.
I love that. Protestants are always looking to undermine somebody's faith and tell them how they were never a Christian to begin with. So that's what we're really good at. But when I'll talk with somebody about like their, the Spirit told me X, I got to do X. Okay. How does God typically speak to you? Go ahead.
One, I also would say, like, is what you are considering, is that consistent with like everything else about like how to be a person, how God acts, like all of that?
Yes.
Right. And if it's not like all lining up, then, we got to kind of fall back and regroup.
Yeah. And I think that's an important point too, is that with the example you gave about like, all right, I feel like God's telling me to marry this person, right? That's a big decision. So the average person is going to, consult God if they're a person of faith. They're going to talk to their friends. They're going to talk to their parents. They're going to talk to their other trusted people, and they're going to kind of take a consensus and be thinking about this thing. Right. So I think there's room for consideration. There's room for thinking and weighing the pros and cons and getting other people's opinions. And we want to be doing that and engaging our brain and our rational mind in this rather than just going with what the feeling says. And because I feel this thing, that doesn't mean it's always true.
Yeah. There's a leader, a senior leader in our church who gave a talk a few years ago about how he's a very well-respected heart surgeon, transplant surgeon. And Elder Runland, he gave this talk about how somebody had like approached him saying that like they were actually like the rightful leader of the church or whatever. And he was like, okay, you're going to have to leave my office. And the guy challenged Elder Runland to pray about it. And he was like, I don't need to pray about this. Like, I know it's not true because it doesn't make sense with like everything else that I know about everything, God, the gospel, the church, the whole bit. right?
Yeah.
And I like that like we can, you know, like we can figure this out. Like we can work on it. Like it'll, you know,
Yeah.
be
And,
okay.
yeah, and I think there's room for that. I think that this kind of conversations I think would fit within kind of the cognitive restructuring piece. If we were doing traditional CBT work, it's looking at the evidence of whatever the obsession is, and is there grounding for it, or is there more evidence of perhaps something else? And if maybe something else has more evidence for it, perhaps that's the more accurate thing. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, the population I work with,
Yeah.
like I work with a lot of university students, a lot of people who are like very well educated, and in a culture that does like place a really heavy emphasis on, study and all of that. So I think for them, it feels more natural that like I should learn how to think this through rather than I should do exposures.
All right, so let's talk about that point, because this is another sticking point that I initially had with ICBT,
Yeah.
and I can see some people falling into this trap, either naturally or if ICBT isn't practiced the best. It's for is ICBT a very cognitive heavy approach that is asking someone who thinks a lot to continue to think a lot?
I mean, yes, but I think it's asking people who are thinking a lot in a really inefficient way by doing compulsions
Uh-huh.
to think in a much more efficient way that's actually going to help them move forward towards their goals.
I think it's a great explanation. So it's looking at the pitfalls in the way that they're thinking.
Yeah.
Where are the pitfalls? Where in the work that you've had using ICBT for religious group, where do you find pitfalls for people? Where do people typically get hung up, and how do you kind of work their way through
Yeah.
that?
I think we spend a lot of time talking about things that may be true, but like don't mean what someone's OCD is telling them that it means. So like say so we right have a belief in like not having sex before you're married, like most Christians. And so sometimes people will have like had some incident when they were in high school or something that they're really worried about, right? And they've gone to their bishop, they've worked it through, whatever, they've repented,
Mm-hmm.
whatever. They've done all the things that a Latter-day Saint is supposed to do in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
And then they go on their mission, they, serve their mission, they get back to BYU and they're dating. And then they start to have all these questions that like, maybe I didn't repent of that properly. Maybe I haven't done what I
Yeah.
need to do. Like maybe I need to go back. Maybe I didn't explain everything to the bishop.
Yep.
Right. And so it's like, okay, like, I mean, who knows what happened when you were 16,
Mm-hmm.
but like, it, whatever it was, is it relevant to what's happening now? Like, would you be worried about this in the way that you're worried about it if you didn't have this fear going through your head all the time that like you're not a good person, that you're not worthy, that you're, not keeping your covenants or, whatever it is. So like that kind of thing. We talk a lot about like how your intention in certain situations
Mm-hmm.
is really important, right? So, if you like go and well, to give like a non like religious example, right? If you like pay somebody for something
Mm-hmm.
and then you get out and you realize that they gave you too much change back, right? Like, I don't think that means that like you're a bad person and you were trying to cheat them, right? Because your intention in that situation was just to pay, right? And
Mm-hmm.
like you had it was totally out of your control that you got the wrong change, right? But like I have clients who would be like paralyzed about like, do I drive back? Do I go back? Like, what do I do? Like, is
Mm-hmm.
this my fault somehow? Right? Um, and I mean, I kind of talk about that a lot actually with the law of chastity. Like, you're not accidentally going to have sex with somebody. Like, if you are intending to follow this law and get married in the temple, then like there's really not a lot of reason to believe that's not going to happen, right?
There's a lot of choices to be made
Yeah.
between absolutely nothing to sex.
Yes. 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 And, I think it's also like you are a fully functioning human being. Like, you're not going to just like all of a sudden, like, totally lose control of like all of your faculties and then, throw out all of your firmly held convictions and everything that,
For anybody interested, though, there are a couple of comics from, I'm going to say, the 80s that I think MTV put out that show they're essentially a condom advocate, pro condom, but basically showing that sex isn't an accident. But the whole comic is this series of events, this Rube Goldberg event that goes from absolutely nothing to oh no, totally having sex, and it's just get a condom. But so Google that. Good luck with what you find, but hopefully you find it. Okay, so you also mentioned ICBT isn't really exposure heavy.
I mean, I don't do exposures hardly ever anymore.
Tell me about that and coming to that conclusion, because I think so much of this podcast and so much of OCD literature out there is going to be talking about how to do exposures, when to do exposures, how to do the right exposures, the point of exposures, all the exposures, right? Why the change?
I think because the ICBT was just working so much better, and it felt like such a more, like, just a better cultural fit for my practice and kind of my personality. And my clients are getting really good results without it.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's like, if I can do 2 months of ICBT and get, in some cases, like really significant reductions in Y-box scores, which of course, like that's not, lots of people require more treatment, than that. But, if I can have good results doing kind of a core ICBT curriculum as a foundation, like I'm going to do that. And honestly, most people, like I treat a lot of people who've had bad experiences with ERP. A lot of it I feel like is just like not super well done. Like the exposures aren't being like well tailored to like their particular anxieties. But also a lot of people who felt like they were being judged for their religious beliefs and things like that in treatment.
Yeah, I can certainly see that. And it's kind of what you were talking about, finding a therapist who understands your religious background, because there are some things that we believe in our faith that to an outsider it sounds crazy. There's a lot of crazy things that we believe, and I'll speak for me. There's a lot of crazy things that Protestants believe, that someone that in the community go like, yep, that's a thing, and everyone else is like, I don't see how you're getting to that conclusion.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I provide exclusively evidence-based mental health treatment in my practice, but I do think that like this is a little bit like my ministry, like being able to translate evidence-based OCD treatment in a way that makes sense for people of my faith. Yeah.
Are there some adaptations you've had to make to ICBT to tailor it to the LDS community, or does it need to be that?
Not really. I mean, mostly it's just having a lot of examples that really resonate with Latter-day Saints, and like, just being able to explain the concepts in a way that feels really accessible to them.
Yeah. Have there been times with some of your clients that you have incorporated some type of exposure work, or shifted either into traditional work or vacillated between the two?
Yeah, I mean, I have a client right now who has, unfortunately, emetophobia. So, like we do exposures for that, of course.
Okay.
I do exposures sometimes. The most common exposure that I do, it's kind of a silly one, is for people who are worried, right? I'll see people a lot of times who will feel attracted to somebody other than their spouse, and then it like turns into this whole like ROCD thing about it.
That's a super fun
one. And so Yeah, so I'll do this exposure that somebody called, this is not my name, but I think it's kind of funny, Hot or Not, where you like go into a crowded place and like look at 10 people, and for everyone, or like on a scale of 1 to 10, like how attractive do I think they are? Like stuff like that sometimes. But I don't do, I mean, sometimes I'll have people who like I had
I'm giggling because I love that exposure, and I think I recommend that exposure routinely,
Yeah.
or something similar to that.
I did have one of the, I don't do a lot of like really funny exposures anymore, but I did have a client who was wanted to get engaged, and she had some like traditional kind of relationship OCD symptoms, but she was also had like a lot of problems like touching keys, and it was something about like coins, like the metallic stuff was like a kind of a contamination thing for her.
Oh, okay.
And so I had her eventually just go get like $50 worth of pennies from the bank, and she was like sticking her hand in there because she wanted to be able to wear the wedding ring or the engagement ring.
Oh yeah.
So she did exposures for that with the bag of pennies.
Yeah. Is that someone that you treated? Sorry if I missed the statement. Is that something you're treating with ICBT and then kind of did that traditional exposure? Okay.
Yeah. Just like so what I tell people is like, I'm like, let's just do some ICBT, right? Like, let's do the foundational stuff.
Yeah.
And then let's see where your symptoms are. And I do tell everybody, I don't want to sound like some anti-ERP person, but I do believe this, right? That ERP is it is a foundational skill for everybody with OCD to know how to do exposures and to understand how they work. So I do always look for like, okay, where's a a one-off or something where we can bring this in and I can like teach you how to do this so that like, I don't want to send people out there into the world like not knowing how to do exposures. That would be crazy.
Yeah, and you certainly don't sound like an ICBT, or an anti ERP person. But I know that there's been a lot of fighting. Anyways, I'm not going to get into that. It's a lot of fun politics about that. I was going to ask something that, again, my brain, doesn't brain sometimes.
No, we're in it. I mean, this
is our life now. Yeah. Okay. So I mean, to get back into, some of the specifics with ICBT. So we've talked a little bit about kind of what the arc of treatment or what kind of the start of treatment looks like, and how we're kind of challenging the legitimacy of the thoughts. I know we didn't talk about the OCD bubble, but folks, go listen to old ICBT podcast.
I do use that concept a little bit, not a ton, but yeah.
Yeah, I call it just the OCD's fantasy land. Yeah, it's anything over in that world. Anything is possible. Anything is possible over there. What does the end of treatment look like from an ICBT lens? How do you know you're done? And what does aftercare look like?
Yeah, I think you're done because I mean, I like give everybody like a Y box and a pious like periodically, right? So we have some data. But, I think that it's that you understand what's going on, and you understand that when you start to feel anxious, you have tools, and that you're able to manage it in a way that feels satisfying for you, whatever that looks like. And then you don't need to talk to me as much. Or at all.
Yeah, I tell everyone my job is put myself out of a job.
Yeah.
Do you hit all the modules, or are there some that you weigh more than others?
I hit them all. I think that there are some that I just feel like tend to resonate better with my population, right? So, we do tend to spend a lot of time on like alternative stories and the like feared self work. We spend a lot of time looking at like, like selectivity of the doubt kind of stuff, right? Yeah. How you're using like different ways of thinking just about your OCD. So that's, it's a little bit different for everybody. I feel like, my only flex as a therapist is that I can just give like infinite examples of how ICBT concepts relate to Latter-day Saints at this point. So
What can you share an example?
sure. So like I would say, like if you go into the temple and you start having like really crazy thoughts, right? So, and you're worried that this means that like you're not taking it seriously, like you're not worthy to be in there, like whatever, right? So, but then we step out, right? If you didn't have OCD, if you weren't like already worried that you weren't a good person and you just got into the temple and you were like having weird intrusive thoughts, like guess what? You would be just like everybody else in the temple, right?
Yeah.
Like that happens to everyone. But if you didn't have this feared self story kicking around in the background, you know, nothing would stick. You would just be like, oh yeah, I was distracted in the temple, no big deal. But like I was there, gold star for me, right? But
yeah,
you know,
yeah, it just kind of shows that like why is it that thought is particularly dangerous or particularly targeted for you is because you care uniquely about being a good person, and that thought puts that fact into question.
yeah, like you can see like you're distressed by this because it relates to your OCD.
Yeah.
Like no, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I think
right.
that certainly echoes that thing that we've all said in OCD land is, you know, the obsessions target someone's so what someone values the most. So the stuff that's most important to you, that's what it's going to try to grab onto.
Exactly.
So,
exactly.
I want to be respectful of your time. I don't know what your time is left, but is there anything else?
I have some kids in a minute.
Yeah, I got to get to my daughter's. Dude, my daughter made it to the softball championships. This is her first time playing softball. She's 7, so I have to go to that. And you know what? We are not a sportsy people. So
sounds like there's some travel ball in your future. Good luck with that.
Why do you have to say that? Oh, goodness gracious. I don't need that in my life, but I'm proud of her, but I don't need that in my life, girl.
I mean, no, it's
too much.
It's a lot, man. It's a lot.
Sounds like you know. All right. So, is there anything else that you'd want to add at the tail end of this to kind of either, is there guidance, encouragement, support, or anything that you'd want to tag on for someone struggling with religious scrupulosity that they may want to know about or think about?
Yeah, I mean, I think to just, you know, find like it's not like this is not a spiritual problem, right? So to find somebody you can work with so that you actually believe that, right?
Awesome. Well, where can people find more about you?
Yes, they can find more about me at my practice website, which is mountainhomeocd.com. And so, yeah, hit us up if you want to do ICBT for scrupulosity.
Love it. And if folks have specific questions for Claire about OCD using ICBT and or maybe even specifically for the LDS community, you can send them in, and would I be able to wrestle you back in? And
yeah. No,
this?
if we want to talk about this more, like absolutely, send me an email right to you. We can come do it more. I'm happy to do. I'm like a little bit of an ICBT evangelist. So,
have you gone on mission for it?
But I don't know, maybe.
All right, maybe it's to actually what you go to the IOCDF conference this summer, and you put up a sign.
Oh yeah, that's true. I could. I had not made a decision about going, but maybe.
Those are the unconverted heathens. Did that come off wrong? That came off wrong.
I don't know.
Curious.
People always have grievances about IOCDF and ICBT, but I've always had good experiences. So I don't know.
People are mellowing. It's a reasonable approach. Anyways, all right. I'll let you go here. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your passion.
Thank you, Kevin.
And wisdom.
I really appreciate it.
All right. Have a good day.
All right. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Fearcast. If you would like your question answered on a future episode, please click on the Submit a Question link at fearcastpodcast.com. If you would like your question answered sooner, please send me a recording of your question to questions@fearcastpodcast.com or by sending me an audio message through Instagram by DMing me at fearcastpodcast on Instagram. If you like the Fearcast, please write a review on your podcast platform of choice. Please remember that the Fearcast is not a substitute for psychotherapy. If you need a little bit of help in your recovery, please go over to fearcastpodcast.com and click on the Find Help link, and there's going to be some information for you there. So until next time, take a risk, challenge yourself, and don't take your brain too seriously. Bye.